For years, Michael Harrington was the only child who never left his father's side. His sister Diane lived far away and rarely came home. Then everything changed. The moment 78-year-old Thomas Harrington became seriously ill, Diane and her husband Robert Cole suddenly started visiting every single week. They said they were there for family, but behind every visit, Robert was quietly convincing Thomas to trust him with millions of dollars through safe investments. By the time Thomas realized the truth, his $3.1 million fortune was already slipping away. But the biggest betrayal wasn't what happened to the money. It was the moment Diane discovered the man she loved had been secretly using her own father as a way to save his failing business. Stay with us until the very end, because today's story proves that the most devastating family betrayals don't always destroy one relationship. Sometimes they force a child to choose between protecting the parent they raised and the spouse they once trusted with their future. Thomas Harrington was 78 years old and had built a successful commercial printing company in Savannah, Georgia, over 4 decades. He had raised 2 children largely alone after his wife passed in 2010, and had built an estate valued at $3.1 million, including the business, his home, and investment accounts that had never been touched carelessly. His son, Michael, 46, had remained close to him throughout, visiting multiple times a week and managing his care after a cancer diagnosis in early 2022. His daughter, Diane, 52, had married Robert Cole, 55, and had built her own life in Atlanta, maintaining a cordial but distant relationship with the family for years. When Thomas's diagnosis became serious in the spring of 2022, Diane and Robert began appearing in Savannah every weekend. Thomas was genuinely pleased. He had missed his daughter, and Robert had always been easy company. Michael was relieved to have additional support and chose not to examine the timing too closely. Robert Cole's commercial real estate business had been struggling for 18 months before the visits began. He had overextended on 2 development projects that had stalled, and his personal financial exposure was significant and growing. He had not told Diane the full picture. He had told her the business was going through a difficult period and that he was managing it. What Robert was actually doing during those weekend visits was managing something else entirely. He spoke to Thomas about investment opportunities in the kind of confident, specific language that Thomas had always respected in business people. He described a commercial development fund that was generating strong returns for a small group of private investors, positioning Thomas's participation as a personal favor he was extending to family. He told Thomas that Michael, while devoted, was not someone with the financial sophistication to understand why this kind of opportunity was worth acting on quickly. Thomas transferred $400,000 into Robert's development fund in June of 2022. Robert transferred another request in August, framing it as an expansion of the original position. Thomas transferred an additional $350,000. In October, Robert presented a third opportunity with similar language, and Thomas transferred $280,000 more. The total reached just over $1 million across 4 months. The development fund was real in structure, but entirely controlled by Robert, and the funds Thomas transferred were used immediately to service Robert's existing business debt rather than any investment position. The quarterly statements Robert provided to Thomas showed projected returns on a position that had already been spent. Michael noticed his father seemed increasingly preoccupied with financial matters he had not previously discussed. Thomas mentioned Robert's investment fund during one of their conversations in late 2022, describing it in terms that Michael found immediately concerning. He asked to see the documentation. Thomas showed him what Robert had provided. Michael called a financial advisor the same evening.
The advisor reviewed the materials and told Michael within 48 hours that the documents contained no verifiable fund registration, no independent auditor information, and no regulatory disclosures that would be required for a legitimate private investment offering. Michael retained attorney Sarah Doyle, a fraud and probate specialist in Savannah. Sarah filed an emergency civil action and contacted the Georgia Securities Division, which opened a parallel investigation. A forensic accountant traced every dollar Thomas had transferred within 2 weeks and confirmed that none of it had reached any investment position. It had gone directly to Robert's business accounts and from there to debt obligations. Sarah contacted Diane through separate counsel and requested her cooperation. Diane asked for 48 hours. What followed in those 48 hours ended her marriage. Diane confronted Robert with the forensic accountant's findings. Robert's explanation was incomplete and inconsistent. Diane called Sarah Doyle's office the following morning and said she would testify. The hearing was held before the Honorable Judge Caroline Hayes at the Chatham County Superior Court. Sarah Doyle presented the forensic financial analysis, the fraudulent investment statements, and the Georgia Securities Division's findings, confirming no registered fund existed matching Robert's descriptions. Then she called Diane Cole to testify. Diane described every conversation she had witnessed between Robert and her father, the specific language Robert had used, the documents he had shown Thomas, and the moment she had understood what the visits had actually been for. She told the court that she had believed she was coming home to support her father during his illness. She told the court that she had filed for divorce the previous week. Robert's attorney argued Thomas had made voluntary investment decisions with full information. Sarah Doyle asked the court to consider what full information looked like when the fund Thomas had invested in had no registration, no auditor, and had transferred his money directly to Robert's personal debt obligations before Thomas had received a single statement. Judge Caroline Hayes ruled that Robert had engaged in deliberate financial fraud against a vulnerable elderly family member and ordered full restitution of the $1,030,000 to Thomas's estate. She referred Robert Cole to the Chatham County District Attorney for securities fraud and elder financial exploitation. Robert was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in Georgia State Prison. His business was dissolved during the proceedings. Thomas Harrington recovered well enough to see the verdict. He told Michael afterward that he should have asked more questions. Michael told him the person who should have asked more questions had been Robert's wife, and that she had asked them as soon as she had the information to ask them with. Diane Harrington, who had returned to her maiden name, settled in Savannah for the first time in 20 years. She told Michael she was sorry it had taken this long to come home. Thomas Harrington had spent 40 years building something that survived because every number in it was exactly where it was supposed to be. A man who had married into his family spent 4 months using that discipline against him. The court ensured it cost Robert everything he had been trying to protect, and the daughter who had been absent for years became, in the end, the person who made the difference. Would you have confronted a spouse with evidence like that, knowing what it would cost? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Court of Shadows for more courtroom drama stories every week.